Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Yep. And where are we at this time?
We are going to be jumping into chapter 40, and so just to give you some context of where we've been. Last time that we were in Genesis, we were looking at chapter 39. We've got the story of Joseph going into Potiphar's house. And one of the things that we didn't mention last time is that chapter 39 has got this chiastic structure that I think is interesting. And so the chapter begins with Joseph, his success in Potiphar's house, and then the chapter ends with Joseph's success in Potiphar's prison. And then from there, if you go work your way in towards the middle of the chiasm, you've got these authors' editorial remarks, where at the beginning you've got Joseph was handsome in appearance, and then at the end of the chapter you've got that Joseph was confined to the king's jail, and then you've got in the meat of the chiasm, you've got Potiphar's wife and her desire for Joseph, and that's in verse 7. And then, but at the end of the story, you've got Potiphar's wife is spurned. And then in the middle of that, you've got the Potiphar's wife requests twice, lie with me. And in the middle of those two requests, you've got Joseph's refusal to commit sin. And so that's kind of the heart of the chapter there. And so I thought that was significant.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of that chapter we talked about last time is Joseph's passing the test, in which, she's kind of put on par with the Eve character from the very first chapters. And so really I think goes right along with what we were saying, that Joseph is put in this Adam and Eve-like test situation, and the chiasm highlights that he passed the test.
Yeah.
That's where we're at in the story right now. We've seen a tested Joseph, but he is sunk further into exile.
Right. And do you think that's meant to contrast between the chapter before and chapter 38 where Judah falls into temptation?
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing at first Joseph, he's a crappy character, and then so is Judah. And then Judah, within one chapter, he quickly has this turn upwards. And here we see Joseph's turn upwards immediately after. And so we're just seeing, again, more parallels between those two chapters.
Yeah. So there's contrast and there's comparison going on between...
Not chapters, but those two stories.
Yeah, those two
Judah
stories.
And Joseph, yeah.
Yeah, those two characters. Yeah, so this brings us to chapter 40. And so what's going on in chapter 40?
So Joseph is in prison. He is in what he will later call the pit once again, which we've talked about that. Go listen to the chapter 37 episode. Kind of the pit is set on par with death and Sheol. He's in Egypt, so not a good situation, but he's about to be lifted up out of the pit. But first, we have to encounter these two offenders that are also in the prison with him. So Joseph has been in the prison, and God has prospered his way again. He's made him fruitful. The guard sees this and sets him again in authority over all the prison, everything that he can have authority over. So we keep seeing these little rises and falls of Joseph is a little turd to his brothers. He rises to a place of authority. He falls very far, and then he rises to a place of authority in Potiphar's house, and he falls very far into prison. Once again, he has risen and to a place of authority, and we're going to see that he's going to rise again soon to a very high place, but we have some steps to walk through first, and then we'll talk about the significance of that final rising.
So, question for you. Are we supposed to see these two prisoners that are there in the prison with Joseph and line them up with the two thieves on the cross next to Jesus?
Where's that from?
I've heard it before. I know I've heard it somewhere. That's
okay.
The first thing that came to my mind.
Gotcha. I know some things from some very good pastors that I respect that I don't think they put much academic research into their work, which is fine. They're doing something pastoral. But no, there might be some similarities that you can draw out between the thieves on the cross and this, but similarity does not equal prophecy.
Right. So that's not a typology, or like we're not...
Right.
Or
there's not even like a long... theme building up to these two guys to say, like, we're expecting two guys to be next to the chosen one in his death.
Right.
Maybe that's the string they're pulling on, but I think you're pulling reaching a little too far.
Yeah, and I just mentioned that sometimes we have the tendency to read Jesus into the text a little bit too much.
Yes, we do. We all the scripture does point to him, just like Jesus says in Luke. But according to the rules of the Old Testament authors, we don't want to rob them of what they're saying by taking and shoving Jesus into every nook and cranny that we can find, because it does a disservice to the message of the Old Testament. And also, just apologetically, I just want to throw this in here, that it does a disservice to those we're trying to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, because if we've shoved him in everywhere where it doesn't even make sense, someone reads this and sees our interpretation and says, you guys are nuts. And so, yeah, let's just do things according to what the author intends so that we can show that Jesus is truly the long-awaited Messiah from the Old Testament. Okay, short detour there.
Sorry.
No, it was a good one. I think it needs to be said. I like to talk too long about some of these things. So, all right, we have these two prisoners, the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh, and they have these two dreams, very similar dreams, with just terms of three going on in them. And we're not going to talk a whole lot about those, but they tell these dreams to Joseph. He sees that one day after their dreams, their faces are downcast, which in this context, they assume some significance about their dreams. And so he says, don't interpretations belong to God, so please tell me. And we already know that Joseph, he's kind of a special messianic figure with the Spirit of God on him. So we don't know why or how he knows he has the ability to interpret these dreams, but he does, possibly because of his previous interpretations that somewhat came true already as he was made Lord over his brothers by his father, at least at the time. I hadn't really thought about that before, actually. His dreams of being Lord of his brothers came true to a degree previously, before he was sent into Egypt and they tried to kill him.
Right.
And sell him. That's interesting, and there's going to be a better fulfillment later.
Right.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So they tell him the dreams where the cupbearer has dreams of these clusters of ripened grapes, and he takes and presses them into Pharaoh's cup. And so Joseph says, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days, and in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you'll once again be his cupbearer. So, again, I think it's just significant to point out here that things come in terms of 3. It's a number of patience, of waiting and anticipation in Scripture, not necessarily always for good or always for bad, but just sort of a time of patience. Because we see it's favorable in this one, but it's not going to be favorable in the next dream. And I do wonder if with the next dream, the baker, if he sees this dream, where we're told that he sees the dream is favorable, and so he wants to have his dream interpreted too. And I wonder if there's not supposed to be a little bit of definitely irony, maybe a little bit of comedy there of like, ooh, yay, this is going to be great. Tell me mine next. You're going to die in 3 days. Yeah. So the poor baker, we don't know what they did, but I guess Pharaoh was nicer to one than the other, or the other one just really ticked him off. So yeah, we see that just terms of 3, anticipation. And it says that on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, or just Pharaoh's day, most translations infer birthday, but it was Pharaoh's day, perhaps birthday, perhaps something else. He made a feast for all of his servants, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his position and hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph interpreted. Now, whenever Joseph gave these interpretations to the cupbearer and the baker, he told the cupbearer, whenever you restored your position, remember me and get me out of this pit because I was put here unjustly. And we're told that in verse 23 of chapter 40, the cupbearer did not remember Joseph but forgot him. And this is not supposed to be taken as actually like he just, it slipped his mind, he forgot, but he did not remember the due loyalty that he had to Joseph for his interpretation and encouragement from God that he gave him. There was a sense of indebtedness, or at least some camaraderie that they should have had. The cupbearer was not loyal to his new friend. Joseph is going to have to continue waiting in chapter 41 until 2 whole years had passed. So again, it's after 2 years, so we're in terms of 3 again. Just like the baker and the cupbearer had to wait in terms of 3, he also has to wait in terms of 3. So we kind of breezed through that chapter 40. Just want to give some highlights in that chapter about the story going on there, because chapter 41 is what this all leads up to, and this is a very significant chapter where a lot of the things that we saw happening in Tamar's story about her vindication are going to start to happen to Joseph, and we're going to see his vindication in this story. So in the 3rd year of Joseph waiting in prison, Pharaoh now has a dream that is also significant. And I'm not going to touch too heavy on what's going on in the dreams. Most of us know this story, that it represents 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Later in the story, Joseph is able to reveal that through God to Pharaoh. But for the time being, he has these dreams. Pharaoh assumes some significance, and his wise men, his magicians, his sorcerers, they can't figure it out. No one can interpret it. And so the cupbearer finally speaks up in verse 9 and says, I remember my offenses today. When I was there in the prison, there was a Hebrew there, and he was able to interpret the dream. So he finally remembers Joseph and speaks up and shows, I guess you could say, some some loyalty to him, but really it just, I think, was fortuitous for him to mention Joseph at this point. So Pharaoh calls Joseph up from the pit, and we're given a few little notes here about Joseph preparing himself for Pharaoh. The text could just say here that Pharaoh called Joseph, and then Joseph appeared before Pharaoh, and that's the end of it. But we're told that Joseph, in verse 14, had shaved himself, had changed his clothes before he came before Pharaoh. Now, changing clothes, we've already seen that's very significant in this whole Joseph and Judah and Tamar story. So we should be expecting something significant. The fact that he's changing his clothes is signaling to us there's going to be a change within the exile, exalted status. Because so far we've seen every time that there's been a change of clothes, he's been forced further into exile, and also same for Tamar, and then she changed right before she was exalted or vindicated. Also, the last time that we saw changing of garments, as far as just changing them, was in chapter 35. Jacob and his family are about to go meet God, and so he says to change their clothes, bury their idols, all those things. And so there might be an act of cleansing here, and I'll talk about why that's important. And I also want to point out the fact that it says he shaved himself, which again reinforces this cleansing idea. Shaving does not happen very often in the Torah. It happens with the Nazirite vows, where you devote yourself to God and remain clean for a period. It also happens in the cleansing rites of Leviticus 13:33 and 14:8 through 9. And so shaving oneself has to do with cleanliness and being cleansed in the Torah. So I think that what we're supposed to see here is Joseph, he is cleansing himself by changing his clothes and shaving himself in a way that would prepare him for the presence of God. And that's, again, we'll talk about that more in a second. Just put that in your back pocket for a second. So there's a long story after that of Joseph being told the dreams and then him interpreting the dreams back to Pharaoh and telling him what's going to happen. Again, not going to spend a whole lot of time there. That one's fairly self-explanatory. You can check out a commentary for any details on that. But again, I want to highlight some of the main points for Joseph in this chapter. So Joseph gives this proposal once he hears the dreams about Pharaoh, appointing someone who is discerning and wise and who can be appointed as an overseer over the land, which Joseph was actually made overseer, same word, over Potiphar's house. Just a little, maybe another link between his risen status in Potiphar's house and what's about to happen to him in this chapter. But everyone was pleased with Joseph's suggestion, and Pharaoh also recognized that the Spirit of God is in this man, so maybe we should use him. He's a good pick. God is with him. Something significant, too, about that phrase, the Spirit of God being within Joseph. The phrase, Spirit of God, has not been used since Genesis 1, when the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters. So I don't want to make too much out of this, but I think that could be something trying to link us back to Genesis 1, that creation act, kind of the heightened status of that part of the story.
Right.
And, we're going to see, actually, Joseph, he is portrayed as a new creation here in a second as well. So in verse 40... Pharaoh, he appoints Joseph as being over all of his house, have command over all of his people, and only as regards the throne will I be greater than you, Pharaoh says to Joseph. And so, once again, he has now been exalted, just like he was in Potiphar's house, over all things except for one thing. Potiphar's wife in Potiphar's house, and now he just can't claim the throne for himself, which again, another link to Adam and Eve. They had charge of all things except for one. Don't touch that tree. Oh, and it mentions too, he was over all the land of Egypt. Everything but the throne. And then, in verse 42, continuing on, Pharaoh took his signet ring. The signet ring again. Remember Judah and Tamar. Tamar presented Judah's signet ring as part of her vindication, as well as his staff and a gold cord. So we have Pharaoh presenting his signet ring to Joseph. He put it on his hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Okay, so again, we're seeing these similar elements from the Tamar story. You can go back and listen to that one again, too, if you want to. But since we're seeing these, we remember Tamar was vindicated in a similar context, so we're expecting Joseph's vindication. That's exactly what's happening here. But Joseph's is even better. So he's clothed in new garments by Pharaoh. This is, again, his exalted garments. We're seeing finally a vindication in this little garment motif, or at least a heightening in this garment motif. But these garments are made of fine linen. This is sheish in Hebrew. So this fine linen, the sheish, it appears often in context of the cloth made to make the tabernacle later, but it's used in concentration in Exodus 28 to refer to the high priestly garments. And we also have a gold chain that is used to hold up the ephod on the priestly garments as well in chapter 28 of Exodus. And so it's not all the same word there with the gold chain, but the idea and the picture is still very similar. It's close to synonymous words used to paint this picture that Joseph's being put up into a priestly status, which, remember, we talked about the garments and the shaving being a cleansing rite. So after this, Pharaoh parades Joseph around to exalt him, show him his new rule. And then he also renames Joseph in verse 45 and names him Zephanath-Paneah. And the name itself, we won't dig too much into the etymology there. There's actually some debate among scholars who look into the names and different wordplays there. But he gives him a new name. And we've talked about that already in this Genesis series, that is a sign of new creation. And he gives him a wife. So who else in the biblical story of Genesis so far has given an exalted priest king a name and a new wife?
Right, God.
Yeah, you have Adam being called man, you have God giving him the woman. And so there's a lot of, again, just parallels to Adam and Joseph. Joseph is now an exalted priest king with a new name, a new wife. He has priestly garments. He's been given kingly clothings and celebrations, things like that. And also in verse 46, the next thing that we're told is he entered into this service when he was 30 years old. That's when the Levites begin service. That's when Jesus started his ministry, because I think they're picking up on the same typological thread. But the author of the Torah here is trying to say, look, he's also entering into the Levitical service, which some of the Levites were priests. So just another tie to that temple structure. Okay. With all that, we see Joseph. This is a very high spot. This is like the climax of the Joseph story, sort of. We have there's two climaxes in the Joseph story later on, but this is Joseph's final, big vindication. He's gone through his exile. He's been tested. He's been proven true, and then he comes out of the pit, out of the literary Sheol, rises to new life as a exalted priest king who looks a lot like a new Adam. And I do think that is significant that Joseph is actually literarily portrayed through the pit language as dying and rising. I think that's actually meant to be in there in the text from the author. And again, you can check out Jeffrey Pulse's book, Figuring Resurrection. He talks a little bit more about that as well. Now, if Joseph is a new Adam, we also see here, again, literarily, this particular Pharaoh for this chapter is portrayed as as God, as Yahweh, which I think for some, you think of Pharaoh as the Exodus bad guy, so this is weird. But remember here that Pharaoh has given him authority over all things. He has clothed him, possibly again mirroring the clothing of Adam and Eve in their priestly garments. He's given him a new wife. He has renamed Joseph, given him a new name, so given him new creation. He has, before Joseph went to go see him, he ritually cleansed himself to go before Pharaoh. And so there are a lot of ways in which Pharaoh is put on par with God in this little story. And again, I say literarily, I don't think they're actually trying to draw any kind of real equation here, but we're supposed to see through this, just through the convention of the story, that Joseph is being literarily brought back into Yahweh's presence and given exodus out of his death situation. And so I think that's really significant just to see that we are supposed to be seeing Joseph's entry into Pharaoh's presence as his entry into God's presence without actually changing the setting of the story and everything. So at this point, I just want to point out, and we'll talk about this more, but we have a chosen elect one who has been tested and proven true. He's been through death and resurrected. He's been made a priest. He's been made a king, a new creation, given his bride in the presence of God. That's our chosen one picture right now. And at this moment, this all just applies to Joseph, but we've been expecting this building chosen one all throughout the story of Genesis, and so far he's been the biggest, or he's going to be the biggest chosen one that we've seen, and the one at the end of the story. Yeah. There's going to be some other things later in the story that really help us to project this into the future and see, okay, this picture is going to be part of our expectation of the chosen one in the future, like the big, real chosen one. So we'll see that as well.
Right. So we have Joseph who comes to new life and new creation, and then in his new life, he's able to bring salvation to many, and he becomes a blessing to all the nations.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're going to see even more of that. And so far, we've seen him being part of the two goats motif as well. And so that Day of Atonement, really atonement for his people, where he's been associated with, again, go back and listen to chapter 37 for that, but he's been associated with the sin offering, which atones for his people, who cleanses them and makes them right to enter into Yahweh's presence. And then also that scapegoat, the goat for Azazel, the one that has the sins put on it and sent out of the land. He's been associated with that goat as well. He's been both goats in this situation, which, again, just, quick peek into the future, Jesus is also associated with both goats throughout the Gospels and the New Testament. And so this is the picture that the author of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, is starting to build. There's some more to add to this picture, but that's what we get so far. Okay, so this new exalted, kingly, priestly Joseph, he begins to go according to his plan and build a city to put food in, to store up food for the coming famine. And it says that Joseph, in verse 49, stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, so that it ceased to be measured. And again, just that's very stock fruitfulness language. Yep. The fact that he said sand of the sea, that's not just a random phrase that he threw in there. We're supposed to just be reminded of the abundance and blessings of God in there. He has all this with him. The Spirit of God has been with him, helping him through this whole situation. And then he also has a couple children while he's in Egypt. It says in verse 50, before the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore them to him. And he called them Manasseh and Ephraim. And the meaning of their names, I think, is, I just want to touch on them here because there's been some different opinions on these. So Manasseh means to forget, because God has made me forget all the hardships of my father's house. And Ephraim, it means fruitful, or is built off the word for fruitful, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So again, I think that this affliction language, that's again pre-Exodus, still in exile or oppression language, and God has delivered him out of that and given him fruitful blessing instead. Some will look at these and say that he is betraying his family by forgetting them and becoming comfortable with the land of his affliction, things like that. I don't think that's what's going on here. I don't think he's forgetting his family, like his love for his family, but rather he was cast out and his brothers tried to murder him, but God has made him so fruitful that he is no longer bound by the situation that brought on. Yeah, I don't think these passages or these verses make Joseph a bad guy here or make him out to be betraying his family in some way. I think that's reading a little bit too much into this. Right. I've seen that before, and I just wanted to point it out. I think this is still a very high point for Joseph, and he is exclaiming through the naming of his children that God has delivered him.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he's forgetting the sin that was committed against him.
I mean, his situation has changed so much that he no longer knows the hardship of what previously was. We know that feeling. If you have something, you're in a hard season of life, then you have a season of life so good. In the hard season, you forget what it's like to be in the good season, and in the good season, you forget what it's like to be in the bad season. Yeah, that's what's going on there. And then in the last few verses of chapter 41 here, this goes into what you were just saying a minute ago, where there was famine in all the land, and all the land of Egypt was famished. And so Pharaoh said, go to Joseph. He delegates that to the image there, the image of God, and says, go to Joseph, do what he says. And so he opened the storehouses, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. And it says that Egypt and all the earth came to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth.
Yeah. How many times is the word all mentioned here?
8.
Yeah, I just see there's this emphasis on the greatness of the famine.
Yeah.
And I know you're going to talk about that word, earth or land, and so. But
I'm not working against your point, though.
Right.
What you're saying is correct.
Yeah. Right. So, and what I'm guessing you're going to say is the word land there doesn't mean like the globe. That's not what they had in their mind.
Yeah. So all the earth, the word eretz, it gets translated as earth. Under a proper understanding, that's an okay translation, but it means all the land, right. all the lands. And also that this is contextual as well. Basically, all the known world at this point around Egypt came to Egypt for food. Right. This does not, as some very popular ministries will say, that the Mayans came to Egypt
at
this period
from South America.
Right. Everyone around the whole globe used their antenna towers in the pyramids to radio out and say, we've got food, and they all came to... No. Anyway, yeah, this is contextual, and also the word all, it's just like the English word all. It doesn't always mean every single thing in the universe. It just means everything within the present context.
Right. And there is this emphasis that, and I do think this goes back to the original promises to Abraham, or that you're going to be a blessing to all nations. And so this is a partial fulfillment of that promise.
Definitely. Yeah, we begin to see him being a blessing to all nations. With that, that all, I would say, is properly understood as
the globe.
All nations.
Right.
Yes, all peoples.
Yeah.
All the peoples that split off of Adam and Eve, which in the biblical mindset is everyone.
Right.
So.
Right.
But no, we don't need to form a theory about the genetic relationships between Mayans and Egyptians and all this stuff, because everyone over the entire globe sent representatives to gather food from Egypt. But so either way, like you said, Joseph, he's being a blessing to all nations. And so, again, I just want to reiterate this one more time, that so far the story of Genesis has presented to us a chosen one who has been tested and proven faithful. He's been through death and resurrection. He's been exalted as a priest and a king in God's presence with his bride and as a new creation, and he is a blessing to all the nations. Yeah, so we'll keep talking about that picture and where it leads, but that should sound familiar to Christians. So let's talk about why that moves forward into the picture we have of Jesus without just saying, oh, it looks similar, so therefore it must be prophecy. Because there's actually an authorial intention here as to why this is meant to be something that points forward to the future Messiah. But we'll talk about that because there's more to this picture, and there's more to how it solidifies in the biblical imagination as to what the chosen one is. We'll talk about that more, I guess, in a few weeks, but we're actually going to take another break, even though we just got done with our Romans talk a couple weeks ago, and we're going to talk about prophecy, because that's also going to help us determine what is and isn't prophecy with this story. What does prophecy even mean? Is prophecy the right word for this? So we'll talk about that, and stay tuned for next week so that we can, just dive into that hard topic, because I feel like it's gonna help us understand our Bibles better, like everything we try to do.
Sounds like a plan.